So, a big welcome to our live audience for Digital Health Investor Talk. I'm your host, Stephen Wardell. I'm the managing partner of Wardell Advisors, a digital health advisory firm, and the author of The Future of Digital Health. Wardell Advisors is helping digital health companies address issues around growth, fundraising, trade sales, and strategic alternatives, giving you more options in today's challenging environment. You can follow me at x.com/Stephen Wardell. Our show today is on the topic of building a health innovation city, why we need a new city for our biggest innovations, and what a health innovation city should include, and also how it's going in Vitalia. Our guest today is Niklas Anzinger. Niklas is the founder and CEO of Vitalia, building a health innovation city in Roatan, Honduras. Vitalia aims to be a better place than San Francisco and Boston to build world-class bio and health tech companies. This show is being recorded and will be included in my podcast series called the Digital Health Investor Talk Show. Subscribe to our podcast on Apple and Spotify, and please leave us a review. We always love getting 5-star reviews. We have new podcast links for the shows, so make sure that you see recent episodes when you subscribe, or you could be subscribing to the old pages. This is not investment advice, and we are not investment advisors. Here's the format for today's show. It's 90 minutes long, and Niklas and I will spend the first part talking about the news and the macro picture and some other topics. And then for the second half of the show, we'll focus on the topic of Vitalia. And we'll be taking your questions throughout the show in the LinkedIn text chat, so feel free to comment there. So, Niklas, welcome to the show, and please introduce yourself.
Hey, fantastic to be here, Stephen. And thanks everyone for listening and tuning in. This is definitely going to be a fun episode. So my name is Niklas. I'm originally from Germany, but I now live in Roatan, Honduras, together with my wife. So the thing we're going to talk about most is Vitalia. So we're building a health and biotech city. And we're going to talk about the why of that. I'm also an investor. I have a VC fund. I invested in about 30 companies, half of which are in bio and health tech. So I'm also in digital health. And my background is in public policy, right? So I was working for Washington, D.C. think tanks. I was working in management consulting with public sector clients. And I studied philosophy and economics to that end. And then I turned to become a startup operator for about 5 years. So I saw the world of policy is a bit too slow moving, and I wanted to make a bigger impact and see more of the practical realities of the world. And after these 5 years, I actually turned to health tech, and I explored the space there. But I was quickly disappointed with what I felt were the real barriers to innovation, less so the science and technology, more so the legal and regulatory barriers. And now that is what I'm aiming to overcome with Vitalia.
That's great. Thank you. And so Vitalia, it is, so I'll just sort of, I'd like you to clarify a little bit of what Vitalia is. It's a city, it's an island, it's an idea, and there's a pop-up city as well. And that has dates coming up in a couple of months. Can you sort of just big picture explain what these are?
Sure. Let me unpack it into two components. So one is Vitalia is a physical hub. And in the future, we want to have more physical hubs. Right. So in these physical hubs, the first one of which is in Roatan, Honduras, we want to be able to bring new drugs and therapies to market in 6 months instead of 10 years. Right. So we have actual facilities there. There's a clinic we're working with. There's a tower that we have where we have leased 32 units, and we have people living there, and some of which are working on startups. So, for example, we have gene therapy there, besides the clinic that also has stem cell therapies available, and also a startup that does cybernetic implants. And then the second part is the community. The community is virtual. There's several thousands members, some of which live here physically, and others live in San Francisco, the Bay Area, or in Lisbon, or in Boston, and some of which also are coming from other parts of Latin America. And the pop-up city is kind of the congregation where the decentralized community from all over the world comes together in the physical place, Vitalia and Roatan.
That's great. Very interesting. By the way, is there a way that someone can stay tuned to Vitalia, such as do you have an email list and people would go to a website to sign up for an email list?
For sure. You can go to vitalia.city And there you'll quickly find the Fountain newsletter, which is a really fantastic, very popular newsletter that gives you kind of the ins of what's happening in the community, upcoming events, and also the kinds of content that we create or produce in terms of explaining what we're doing here, startups that are happening here, right? New startups that received investment and things like that.
And the Vitalia pop-up city, how is that different from the actual city, and what are the dates of that? And is there a specific event on a specific day that you could call attention to?
Sure. So to give a bit of a background on pop-up cities, so people sometimes see Burning Man as a pop-up city, right? But it takes place over the course of, I think, 10 days. And the idea of a pop-up city comes from really deep from the crypto space. So from very innovative minds like Vitalik Buterin, the founder of Ethereum, and Balaji Srinivasan, who's the author of a book called The Network State, and who used to be a partner at A16Z, the biggest crypto VC in the world, and also a former CTO of Coinbase. And Balaji is writing about the idea to start new societies, right? So new societies that initially meet online, right? So increasingly your friends or the ones that you have most kind of aligned interests with are international, right? And there's an increasing number, tens of millions of digital nomads, and people really gravitate to people with similar interests. But they still live in different places. Like when you're in San Francisco, you have a high enough density to have a high number of highly aligned people that are, for example, in some very niche field you're interested in your case, digital health, in other cases, crypto. And the pop-up city is the idea to really bring people together in the physical world that come from these online communities. So Vitalik Buterin did a pop-up city called Suzalu in Montenegro last year that brought several hundreds of people and some really famous people. And that had people at an average of about 100 or 150 people live together for more than 2 months. And that really spawned an explosion of more pop-up cities. So now there are several dozen pop-up cities all over the world where people that are interested in the frontiers of technology, crypto, longevity, biotech, synthetic biology, and many others come together to work on startups, to live with other people, to work with other people on new projects. And Vitalia was really one of the first pop-up cities after Suzalu, right? So Vitalia basically got started with a pop-up city, right? We didn't yet have a physical community in Roatan, but we saw it as the best place in the world to realize these ideas around like longevity and sort of creating a different health system with different incentives. So the pop-up city was basically a seeding strategy for a permanent community here. So we brought several hundreds of people together here, and afterwards a couple of them stayed. And we're going to do more pop-up cities in the future, including the next one starting at January 6th for another 2 months, to invite more people to be part of that community. And if they want, they can stay after, or they're still part of the community because they've made friends and they can meet them or be connected, even if they live in different places around the world.
So it starts January 6th, and I think it lasts 2 months. Is that right? It's called Vitalia Forever, and it lasts 2 months. Is that right?
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And there's 3 sub-theme weeks, right? The first one is longevity biotech. So this is questions about like hard science. The second is crypto cities, like it's about questions around money, identity, and governance that can enable us to do things like fund science or the infrastructure we need to build a district. And the third is we call human enhancement. And this is probably where digital health is most placed in. So we talk about healthcare delivery, different incentive mechanisms, healthcare models, quantified self, and even things like augmentation through hardware, right, through the chips or through Neuralink, and also with AI. So these are the 3 sub-themes. And then afterwards, we also have a 1-month startup residency, right? So we stay for another month in March, and this is specifically tailored to startups that really want to explore building a business here.
That's great. And and part of the reason I heard about that a while back, and I was really intrigued. And part of the reasons I wanted to talk to you on the show about it was that I'm sure that some of the members of my audience are kinds of people who really enjoy taking a nice vacation in the middle of winter. That's an important part of their winter. And they might be thinking Miami or Hawaii or Disneyland in California or Mexico or Cancun. And this is just or Barbados. And this is just to encourage them, hey, you could steer your vacation to Roatan to Vitalia in Roatan in Honduras, and you would get a 2-for-1. You would get a Caribbean vacation, and you would also get a chance to see a pop-up city and a health innovation, a temporary pop-up city and a permanent health innovation city. So that's really great to know. Thank you. So next, I'll get into our news section, and so the first category is macro news. So in macro news, there hasn't been a lot of macro news to report. The Fed is clearly in an environment of cutting rates, and that means they think they've beat inflation if they're going to be in a rate cutting environment. And both of those are really good news, because in the startup innovation world, high rates are bad news. High rates are causing hesitancy by investors. High rates have been a problem. And so it suggests that we beat inflation and we're starting to cut rates. So that's good news. But there's also a sort of a sense of paralysis right now, I would say, which is around the election. And it's the new all day, every day, the top story in the news is the U.S. presidential election. It's less than a week until the U.S. presidential election. And what I've been hearing from people, Trump was elected in 2016. People thought markets would fall. Markets actually rallied and went up. So nobody really knows what would happen to markets in the short term if either candidate is elected president. But what people are concerned about actually would be post-election chaos that lasts for months. And the U.S. election system, was designed over 200 years ago in a very different era, and it has not been modernized the way other country systems have been modernized. And so there's this room for chaos, for us not knowing the answer on the first night or subsequent nights, and that creates this opening for people to feel very, very upset and concerned afterwards. So there's concern that there will be a long, drawn-out period of paralysis after the election, and investors want to understand that better before they commit. So that's some of the macro news. So, Niklas, any thoughts on that, or are you seeing any macro trends in the world of health innovation, like biotech and health tech?
I mean, what I keep hearing is that investment in biotech is not in good shape, and it's in many ways going down, right? And I am a bit removed from the direct impacts felt in the United States from the elections and the macro trends, right? So as you heard, I'm in crypto, so I'm not really bought into the US financial system anyway. And I'm not a citizen, even though my wife is a citizen, right? So, and I've always been a very passionate admirer of the original American values and the story of the founding father and the US Constitution that was designed. So I follow that with great passion and interest, although with the current policies, I am somewhat removed. I don't believe in either choice is going well for the country. I believe there are very systemic problems that neither side will be willing or is willing to fix, right? Because the political capital that you need to make unpopular choices is not available on either side. And at the same, so I'm preparing myself to have kind of a parallel track, both when it comes to my financial future and investment through crypto, and also when it comes to healthcare, right? So I have been very happy with the quality of healthcare that I received in places like Mexico, for example, where I've been a digital nomad. And I think it's very surprising to people that in many ways, the healthcare there is much better. People would think, okay, it's much better in Europe than the United States. I don't think it is, right? So it is really good in places like Mexico. So for me, that's the most macro trend, sort of that decentralization away from sort of some of the big powers, or sort of being bound to like one country or being a resident like me in Germany in the past, or what I would otherwise be in the United States. So it's that sort of have a diversity of options, which is something that I think is in many ways really affecting the world, right? So for example, when countries are increasing taxes, such as Norway recently, people are moving to where their wealth is safe and where they're treated better by governments. Right, the United States historically was a haven for that, and they still get net millionaire migration, but they're also getting increasingly less of that. And these people instead move to Dubai and Singapore, which therefore also become more innovative when it comes to governance, more innovative when it comes to sort of your financial sovereignty, and also more innovative when it comes to healthcare, as it so happens. So this is kind of the most macro trend that affects me.
Yeah, it's very interesting. So Americans are somewhat parochial. Many Americans don't leave the country. Those who do leave the country for places like Canada or Britain, or maybe Germany or Italy. And they have a perception that countries like Singapore, Malaysia, Mexico, and India are third world countries. And the actual definition of a third world country is debatable. But if you go to Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, or Singapore, or Mexico City, or a top city in India, you may find that you have gleaming skyscrapers on the outside, first-rate services, first-class office space with air conditioning, perfect connection to the internet, better connection to the internet, better cell phone, better Wi-Fi. You may find all of these things, and then at a lower cost. And sometimes there's even the business of medical tourism, where people will seek out expensive procedures and intentionally do them in other countries. And those other countries used to brag, we have U.S. licensed, U.S. trained physicians in our country. You can have your expensive procedure done in our country. They don't need to say that anymore if they can, and it doesn't have to be a U.S. trained physician anymore. So that's definitely, there's a decentralization, and you'd expect this to happen over time. Knowledge diffuses. America is an extraordinarily open country that makes the blueprint of its own success available to other countries, and so you'd expect this diffusion to happen. And that's also the role of consultants and academics who've done very well over the last 50 years, has been to spread and diffuse these ideas, help other people be successful. So next, I'll just delve into the fundraising environment. So I think I was just at the health conference. Here I'm focused on the fundraising environment in digital health. And I think at the health conference, there was a combination of disappointment and hope about fundraising. So the disappointment was that we've been hoping for a better environment the last 3 months. We're now 3/4 of the way through the year. Everyone knew the first 6 months of the year were rough and tough and risk off in terms of early stage fundraising, talking about seed A and B fundraising. But there was a hope we'd see lift number of deals, valuations, better terms in the third quarter. And effectively, we did not see that in the third quarter, and that's disappointing. But fundamentals are improving, and we're hoping to see it in the fourth quarter. So that was the disappointment and hope at the health conference. So Rock Health came out with a report a few weeks ago that said that third quarter was effectively flat as compared to second quarter and first quarter. That was the disappointment. But the reason people think we will see that lift is a couple of factors. The first is that digital health funds raised money and have the money to invest. Now, there have been some issues with making capital calls on LPs, and that's an opaque issue. It's hard to know about that. Some funds have had trouble making their capital calls on LPs. But in general, the funds have money to invest. They have just been holding back. They've been raising their standards. They've been focusing on a few hot areas like software in AI in healthcare and software for GLP-1s in healthcare. But other areas they have been cold on in digital health. But we see that investors have been holding back, but they have to put the money in those funds to work, or they have to return it. That's one factor. The second is that stock market indices are at record highs, and that's got people excited about a number of things. A third is that we seem to have dodged a recession. So a fourth is that other areas of investment near digital health are coming back. And so digital health should also come back. And another is that it hasn't happened yet, but there's an expectation that we will see the IPO window open. And that's a very positive signifier. What needs to happen is we need to have a few high quality companies IPO, there's demand by the buy side for IPO. The buy side is firms like Fidelity and BlackRock and Citadel. They want to see IPOs, but they need to see some high quality companies in tech and healthcare go public and be successful. And if they go public and be successful, then that will reignite the IPO window. It'll open more widely, and then you could see some digital health unicorns go through that window and go public. And if that were to happen, then that means that investors in digital health can exit and harvest their investment, and then they can turn around and repay, distribute to LPs, and raise new funds and put new money into young companies in digital health. So there's a bit of indigestion, and it doesn't make sense with the stock market at such high levels for the IPO window to be closed for so long. But there's a hope that we will see it. We'll probably see an attempt to open the IPO window this fall and winter, so that's soon. There's a lot of people that want to go out for IPOs. There's a lot of buy-siders who want IPOs. They just want to make sure that in the aftermarket, the stocks will be treated well. Stocks will basically go up and stay up. And we need to see that. So any thoughts on that? That was a little bit of talk about the early stage fundraising environment. Any other thoughts on that, Niklas?
Yeah, I mean, not concretely to the events that happened, but I get asked by founders all the time when they should start a company or fundraise or whatever. And the debate is always, should they do it in an up market or in a down market? And I always say it doesn't matter, right? So in an up market, you might get like a lot of money, but that also means you're less forced to be creative, and also you might face a down round later if the up market was kind of too high or overvalued, or you're in a bubble. And conversely, it can actually be an advantage to start in a down market because you're much more forced to be scrappy. You're much more forced to show like real sophistication, to build real traction with users and things like that. So from the perspective of a startup founder, I would not worry too much of these things. The best time to start a company is always now, and always when you feel that urge or itch that you want to do something or change the world in a meaningful way, or there's something about the world that you want to be different.
Yeah, thank you. And I would add to that an insight I heard from someone recently that I thought was very wise, which was that the time to start a company is the correct time with respect to a technological inflection point. So examples of this would be that if mobile phone technology exists, but it's very expensive and only some rich people use it, and the conventional wisdom is that most people are well served by existing wireline phones, and you foresee an inflection point. You foresee that the price will fall, and that it's a very different medium, and it's a much more useful medium, and it'll be used by different kinds of people for different purposes. Then you want to. There's going to be an S-shaped, a sigmoidal adoption curve, and the time to start a company is when you are in advance of the inflection point. And you don't want to start a company if you had an inflection point and now you're late to the trend. So looking for trends, jumping in advance of the trend, and then the blessing that you get is that the trend drives you. So you're growing at 75% a year, and everybody thinks you're a genius. But your genius was just that you got in front of the trend. It's not necessarily that you're the world's best salesman or the world's best product manager. Your genius was that you got in front of the inflection point. So I'll jump on to consolidation environment now. So there's been more and more talk about consolidation, and in digital health, there's been under consolidation for 10 or more years. Basically, the policy of low interest rates meant that young companies, there was a wonderful opportunity with low interest rates for actors to enter digital health. And so you had entry of talent, entry of new products, entry of new companies, entry of capital into digital health when there were low interest rates. And I was a Wall Street analyst at the time, and I would say things like, we've seen a lot of entry into the sector of products and companies, And now it's time for there to be a shakeout and a consolidation. And a shakeout means that the products that don't make it to be very successful get shut down. And the consolidation means that the bigger companies acquire the smaller companies. And then it didn't happen. I said there should be a shakeout and consolidation. And it didn't happen. And the reason it didn't happen was that it was so easy for companies to raise the next round of funding. And they could often raise the next round of funding at a high valuation. And if the consolidator offered to buy them, the consolidator would offer a lower valuation to buy them. So it didn't make any sense for a seller to sell their company at a lower price to a consolidator. But we're seeing now interest rates are higher, valuations are lower. It's harder to raise the next round of funding. And so we're seeing that people are talking more about mergers. And so I'll just call attention. I think I mentioned this in the past, but Alyssa Jaffe of Seven Wire and Chrissy Farr, who was formerly of CNBC and is now starting her own venture fund, they published a piece saying that digital health is about to enter a scale game, which is to say that the incumbents who are buyers of software and buyers of companies are so big, they've grown 100% in the last few years. Lilly, United, HCA, these are the companies that they cite, that to be a vendor and to matter to them and to sell software to the incumbents, you need to be bigger. You need to be bigger. You need to be able to make a difference to them. They need to be able to think that they're going to be 10% more efficient if they buy you. And for that, you're going to need to be a bigger company with more products and services. And so they called it the scale game, is that these many little vendors in digital health need to scale up rapidly now so as to be able to sell to these giant incumbents, sell software to the giant incumbents, or be acquired either by the giant incumbent themselves, the way that United Optum acquires companies, or to be acquired by some large vendor in the space that sells into pharma or whatever. So, that's a growing consensus that we can expect to see for a number of reasons. Consolidation. That's good news because young company leaders need to be able to sell their company to exit. Investors who've invested need to see the company sold and get a return at exit. So, and it hasn't been happening we've had under consolidation since 2009, basically. That's 15 years. So, Niklas, any thoughts on the consolidation environment?
Not so much thoughts, but more question, because I was kind of curious, because in my bubble, the discussion has been recently about how M&A has become harder due to the current regulatory environment, especially under the FTC. So I was wondering to what degree that affects what you're seeing right now, and if that's even seen in where you were looking at.
So it's definitely a negative. So in fact, for entrepreneurs and investors, they need to believe that they're going to invest their lives, their time, their careers, their skills, their money into building a company, and then they can raise money, and then they can exit in a trade sale or in an IPO. And both of those are in trouble right now. The IPO window happens to be closed right now. It could be open, but if it were open, there would be issues around heavy regulation of IPOs that make it much harder. Some people have estimated that if you IPO, it creates a total waste of 1 to 5 million in costs per year of hiring things like accountants and compliance that is not needed if you stay private. And just for the benefit of having gone public, and that causes some companies to choose to never IPO, but it makes their path riskier, harder, worse for investors. Investors have to believe they're going to be able to exit in one way or another, or they'll take their toys and they'll go home if they don't believe that. Now, in the world of digital health, we're talking about companies that are often Series A, Series B, Series C, Series D, going public for the first time, or being bought. And so this could be a unicorn, which means that it's a private company with a valuation of $1 billion. And then its last private valuation was $1 billion. And then 2 years later, it's bought by a consolidator for $2 billion. Okay, that would be a success. And this is tiny. This is so tiny compared to, we hear the stories about Lina Khan at the Federal Trade Commission doesn't like a merger because the consolidated company would have too large of a market share, and that means that there wouldn't be any competition in the market sector, and so she's blocking it. But in that case, you're talking about companies that are 100 billion, being bought, and so I can't think of a single digital health deal, which would be a $2 billion deal, that's been blocked. It's only the really big ones. And so that has the problem with consolidation of the biggest companies has cast a pall on the whole financial sector, but it has not been an issue in digital health. Currently, the amount of these acquisitions that's happening in digital health is low, but it's not because Lina Khan at the FTC is blocking them. It's because of other factors. It's because consolidators feel for economic reasons it's not a good time to buy right now. Maybe 3 years ago, consolidators believed it was not a good time to buy target companies because they had incredibly high valuations. They were valued at 20 times forward revenue. And the consolidator was saying, I'm valued at 7 times forward revenue. I can't buy this small company that's valued at 20 times forward revenue. It's too high. That was 3 years ago. Today, they're saying that management team still wants a high price. They know they can't get 20 times forward revenue. They still want a high price. I think I'll wait and see which companies are thriving and which are not thriving in the new environment. And I think I'll wait until they acknowledge that the price is going to be a lot lower for them. So that's why consolidators are waiting today with target companies. It's not because of that they got a letter in the mail from the FTC that Lina Khan says she's blocking them. Or their lawyers told them that that's a real problem. But that's a good question. So then IPO environment, we have not seen them. We're waiting for the IPO window to open. It could happen any time. Probably the planners who do these things at investment banks said don't do it before the election. Probably if there's optimism after the election, probably we'll see some companies going out for IPOs. Now, interestingly, we're looking for big, high-quality companies to go out and have IPOs and be successful, and that opens up the window. What we have seen is that Omada and Hinge have filed S1s. This is great news. It means, among other things, you can go and read their S1 that has a wealth of information about some of the more mature companies, 10-year-old companies in digital health who've been innovators for a long time. How are they doing? So that's one thing. It means they would like to go public. It means they have a period of time when they can suddenly go public because they made this filing. And so it means that at any time they've already chosen an investment bank. At any time that investment bank can go out and start talking to investors about an IPO. And then some of that is done quietly, but at a certain point they have to be very public about that they're doing it. And then we start to see investor presentations and management roadshows. So that's, let's see. So just moving on. So the next is business and trade journal news. And here I'll just mention a couple fundraisers. So first of all, last few weeks, not a lot of fundraisers. So that's consistent with what I mentioned before, which was that we want to see a lift in fundraisers, but we haven't really seen a lift in fundraisers. I'll mention the first one is People One Health, a hybrid care provider focused on preventative care, announced a $32 million Series B led by Google Ventures and Glenn Tolman. Glenn Tolman is the former CEO of Livongo, and he's viewed as sort of a man with a golden touch. He's running Transcarent, which is a firm, but he's also a private investor. He's also connected to Seven Wire Fund, which is an outstanding digital health venture fund. And so this is employer-focused, value-based primary care with a focus on preventative care that has real clinics in Pennsylvania and Florida. So I found this very interesting. One of the trends here is hybrid care. And so this is a belief in care that is both in person with bricks and mortar clinic and also care that is online. So leveraging that in a way that's more effective and costs less. Really intrigued. And so we've seen a lot of investment in hybrid care. Also, the fact that this is a provider. This is not a company that sells software. This is a company that sells care. That's very important. It gets around the whole problem of there's a difficulty selling software in healthcare. So you don't have to sell software in healthcare. You can sell care in healthcare. You can be an innovator. The joke is that instead of the leader of this care company wearing a white coat, they're wearing a black turtleneck because they're a technologist, not a doctor leading this. So this is an example of VCs backing a care provider that's a tech company, a tech-enabled services, hybrid care, instead of backing a software company. Also interesting is that Google Ventures is backing this. So Google usually has a mandate to invest in incredibly scalable software. Well, care is not the same thing as scalable software. So this is at Google Ventures, or GV. GV is technically now, I think, independent of Google, but it used to stand for Google Ventures. They used to be the corporate venture fund of Google. But the fact that they are able to, that they're investing in care as opposed to investing in software, data, or AI is interesting. Then there's Diania Health, which is an AI-enabled healthcare data company. They announced the close of a Series A fund around $10 million led by HealthX Ventures. They automate the reading and analysis of healthcare data for more streamlined clinical research. So this is in the research sector. That's interesting. And so what I saw here in this company was that this is an AI company. So there's actually a boom in investing in early stage in AI in healthcare. There's been a breakthrough with generative AI. It's 2 years old. There's been a wave of both young companies starting up and also investors who like these kinds of companies. And so this is one where this confirms that the trend that we have seen is still going on of investors like AI in healthcare. Here's another company. So any thoughts on, Niklas, on these two deals or any other business news in healthcare that you want to bring to this audience?
Sure, I was just looking up because my cousin is the founder of a company called Arlo that's in digital health, right? So they're building a stop-loss solution for small businesses for employee insurance, healthcare insurance plans, right? So I think they raised about 2 or 3 months ago, and I was trying to look up by whom, but it was also quite big name investors. So he has a really great newsletter that's called healthtechstack.io. That is one of my primary sources to be in tuned to the digital health ecosystem.
That's great. And so we have John in our audience asks a question, which is, I think it would be useful to have a discussion in this conversation about future risk as it relates to human health, wellness, and thriving, especially as we're living longer, and why innovation cities at scale and investing in them would be something to adopt at scale to manage the risk. Well, and we'll get to this more when we have the second half of the show on Vitalia. But so you know, there is most countries love their older people, but then older people and adult children take care of older people, and these are our best voters and our best members of society. But then also they retire at age 65 or roughly then, and most don't have enough to survive with dignity after retirement. And so what do we do? And we've come up, every society has its own solutions to that. But then what happens if people live 30 years longer? And what if their health puts them in a retirement position, but they're going to live for 30 years longer? And we're seeing in countries that when Social Security was born in America, there were many workers for each retiree. But today, there's only a few workers for each retiree. And it's projected in the future, both in America, that there will be fewer and fewer workers per retiree, and also that Social Security will be insolvent in the future, that it will be so big in terms of the annual cost that the country can't afford it. So that's a real risk there. So, and I think part of the answer to this question is the concept of health span, where people have energy and drive and happiness and to continue working after 65, so that and every year that they work with a good salary means that they're not burning up their savings, and they're possibly adding to their savings, so it can change the calculus. But we don't want people to be in a terrible work situation at age 65 and face 10 more years of thankless, unhappy work either. So that means that certain advances that could be paid for by the government will expand lifespan, but not health span. And we have to be careful that we don't simply expand lifespan without health span. And other ones may be harder to find, but they expand both health span and lifespan. And that seems to be more helpful overall socially. So that's just, but there's no one is truly in charge, and no one controls either any of these things. So we don't know what we're going to get. But Nicholas, any thoughts about a discussion about future risk?
Sure. I mean, people have a very warped perceptions of risk, right? I think especially when it comes to perceptions of risk in healthcare, the one thing that almost no one is speaking about or is aware of is that much of it is really cultural. Like, you imitate what others are doing. And when it comes to healthcare, it's actually surprising, and there have been many studies that even when you should be very highly incentivized to seek out the best care, for example, like urgent cancer treatments or whatever, people still don't do like very thorough research, right? They really want to trust in an authority, right? And much of the medical healthcare system is really built around the idea that you want to have someone that you can trust in an emergency, right? So this is where the source of authority is coming from. But what's to be said about that is that the institutions that sustain that system are from an industrial age, right? And they're really not apt to the modern world, where culture can change much faster and where you can much quicker, again, change your culture and sort of exit to certain groups that have different ways of doing things, right? Sort of that have ingrained a more healthier lifestyle, that have ingrained a much different way to pay for healthcare. So this is kind of what we will see with new cities and new societies that really adopt, that really decentralize cultural evolution away from sort of monolithic country blocks that come with one set of institutions. And that will be driven very largely by many of these countries or these institutions failing, right? So you mentioned already in the United States, the levels of debt are unsustainable, right? And that's, so the United States has about 100%, 20% debt to GDP ratio, 36 trillion in debt. 17% of US GDP is spent on healthcare. And it's projected to increase even further. It used to be at 5% in 1960. And it might go, if not stopped or there's nothing significant changing, it might go up to 40% by only 2040. Right? That is insane. And most of it is driven by Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. Right? And so if these things aren't in a new way or form changing, and again, policymakers don't have an incentive and they can't really change these things, right? Because any such measures would be extremely unpopular, right? So you'd have to just keep kicking the can down the road. And eventually there will be, that's how it's always been. There will be a consolidation, there will be a bubble, there will be a crisis, and people will then be able to opt into different sets of institutions. And this is when there will be an industry available of sort of new jurisdictions and cities inside the United States and outside. Right, so there's also the potential to do kind of charter cities, to do the kind of federal reform that would allow more healthcare innovation at a more state level. So these are also things we could talk about in some way in some time in this podcast. So that's why I really highly recommend that you need to prepare yourself for sort of diversifying your life stack away from sort of a system that keeps you in a state or where you're signed up with like retirement by age 65. But then that's who's paying for that, right? And again, the politicians are kicking the can down the road. So you have to really have a parallel system and take measures into your own hand in terms of preparing you for your financial future and retirement. If not, then you won't be in a very good situation then. And these systems are then also not adapted to longevity, right? Both lifespan and health span. And of course, with the current systems of social security and retirement, the living to 130 is unsustainable. Right. So these kinds of things are incompatible in many ways with how we're doing things right now. But at the same time, I think it is that does not mean we shouldn't do lifespan or health span extension. That just means we should opt into or build different kinds of institutions, right? And that comes from the core moral premise, which underpins my work, that life is good and death is bad, right? So being alive, being conscious, being able to touch grass, like doing that without having to worry about your health, instead of having more of that, is great. And sort of suffering from aging and from disease that inhibits your ability to enjoy these things and also gives you less of it, that's bad. And I'm trying to deliberately making it sound very obvious. So instead of sort of trying to design interventions in longevity around our current institutions, we should design our institutions around having longer and healthier lives and the moral urgency of that.
Yeah, thank you. That's interesting. And we often don't think about it that way. Our institutions were created at a time when it seemed pretty obvious that you'd work a few decades and then you would die shortly after age 65 or something like that. We didn't build them around ideas like you're talking about, or around the concept of longevity. So David asks a question of, I would like to understand why there isn't an international test that allows physicians to practice anywhere in the world without the need to retest or recertification to pay additional fees to practice. Do you think this would shift the supply side and create more opportunities? So it's a really good question, David. And so there's sort of a meritorious reason, and there's also what I'll call a guild-based reason. And the meritorious reason is that medicine is a cottage industry to every country. There's diseases in some countries that don't exist in other countries. We're sort of just beginning to sort that out now. There are people, I'll give two examples. This is from the past a little bit, but for a long time culturally in Japan, if a man had cancer, the doctor would not tell them because they might tell their spouse. They might tell, if a man or woman has cancer, they might tell their spouse, but not tell them because if you couldn't do anything about it, then let the person live a nice life until they're surprised at a later date. And then in Germany, there was a disease called Herzinsuffizienz, which didn't exist in other countries, but German doctors were very concerned about it and treated patients for it. And so we're only now beginning to have evidence-based medicine and having understanding medicine across countries and understanding that in general, people of different parts of the world, different races, their healthcare, with some exceptions, is roughly similar, and we can treat them as we can treat someone in Mexico similarly to someone we treat in America or whatever. And this wasn't understood in the past. And there's always a merit reason that doctors, they're trusted with incredibly powerful drugs that could be addictive and destructive. And so we really want to know these are our doctors obeying our rules and have control over these doctors. That's why they need a Massachusetts license to practice in Massachusetts, and not just anybody can get that license. And it's a big deal. That's the meritorious reason. But there's also a guild reason, which is that the medical establishment in America has been criticized for a long time for making it very hard to be a doctor and limiting who can get in and limiting the size of medical schools and trying to block foreign doctors. You talk about it's a project and it's a cost, it's a problem for a foreign doctor who's excellent They're not all excellent, but for a foreign doctor who's excellent to come into America, move their practice to America, get licensed in America, that's all expensive, difficult, takes a long time. Um, and that is intentional because the medical establishment very much protects its own. It limits the number of seats in medical schools. The number of primary physicians in America could probably double or triple, and to serve America better. But then doctors would be paid less, and the medical establishment has a lot of respect. They're some of the biggest lobbyists at the state level, at the federal level, and they protect the guild of medicine, and they want you to pay your full dues if you're going to be able to participate in the market. And that it does ensure quality in some ways, but it also it blocks people who'd like to come here. And this is true not just in the U.S. but also in other countries. I think famously in Britain they've imported a huge number of non-British doctors because the British system restricted the number of doctors, and that there simply weren't enough to treat Britons. So it's a good, and so it may be a good idea to have some sort of test, but that would it would hurt doctors who paid in the U.S. system and expected to be able to practice with some protection in the U.S. system. That's the guild argument, which most people don't like, but doctors like. And then the other issue is that you would have strangers coming into the U.S. able to prescribe opioids and profit off the system and do that. And the current system controls that better. It keeps that out, it controls it better. And so you'd have to figure out how to deal with. We give doctors a lot of trust, a lot of authority, a lot of handling very powerful, important things, and you're talking about letting outsiders freely come into that system, and most countries are not entirely happy with that. So, any thoughts, Niklas, on answering David's question about why isn't there an international test that allows physicians to practice anywhere?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more on your guild argument. And just to make sure that listeners understand, this doesn't only mean that internationals can't practice there. That is also the reason why you go to medical school for 10 plus years, right? Because what guilds or cartels do, and they've granted basically state monopolies because they can control the entry bar exams, is that they control the supply of labor coming into the profession, right? Because if there's limited supply of new doctors and medical practitioners, that means wages stay higher, right? So basically increasing the barriers to entry through the exams is constraining that supply and keeping sure that they have high wages. So I don't think that is a very good idea or system that grants some organizations these kinds of monopolies. I think that's also in many ways, but it's something that exists all over the world, not only in the United States, right? So, and I think that is not a good way things are done.
And so there have been some intriguing discussions, which is that people point out that today, U.S. medical schools, which don't provide enough seats for there to be enough doctors for Americans to be well served, and they're not doubling their number of seats in response to calls to do this, but they kind of select for the kind of person who could memorize 4 medical textbooks. That's the person who gets into medical school. And we needed that. We needed someone who was walking around and was outstanding in their ability to memorize textbooks. And if we didn't have that, people would die. And so that was understandable. And everyone here went to high school, maybe college. We all knew that one person who was going to score well on the MCAT and was going to get into medical school was going to memorize those textbooks, whatever. And many people have pointed out that today you don't need that. You don't. All the data is in EMRs, and there's clinical decision support tools that do all of this work that tell you how much of a drug should go to a man who's 60 years old who weighs 300 pounds. How much diabetes drug should they take? A doctor does not need to do that calculation on a notepad using reference data points they learned in medical school. That's all provided now. And so there's been talk about who could be a doctor in the future. And some people sort of say seriously, but partly joking, that the kind of person who goes to film school or the kind of person who becomes an athletic coach could be a doctor in the future. They don't need to memorize 4 medical school textbooks anymore. But they do need to, when you get negative, life-altering diagnosis that says that you have cancer, maybe you need a coach who's going to tell you that they're on your side and they're going to get you through the next 6 months, which is going to feel terrible when you take chemotherapy and have surgery. It's going to be just terrible, but they're going to be there. And when you get new information, they're going to feed it into the AI system and come out with the next best step for you.
Yeah.
But they're your coach. So they're
Yeah.
going to coach
If I
you
may add
through
one more thing,
this incredibly
I think the
complicated
coach.
U.S. healthcare system. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's so true. Like the doctor's education is really. So you mentioned that coaches might in the future be doctors, and also something that is really puzzled and surprised by is, so what is the most important skill when it comes to reading the science literature as applied to a patient, sort of consuming new data, right? So you can argue AI can do that. I doubt it, because you need a basic understanding of something that's called conditional probability, which means the probability if one event occurring, what about the other event? Okay, if that patient had the symptom, considering the data we have on patients with the symptom, that they're likely to have this disease. So this is kind of the most basic mathematical operation that you need to be able to do, and you should be able to do it, right? Just because otherwise it's very hard for you to ask the AI the right question. When doctors were put to the test, almost no doctor could answer even basic questions about conditional probability. Right. So the system of making people just memorize what are the facts and what they're supposed to do in certain situation makes us really makes doctors really into complete reactive cogs. Right. So if there's no like official answer or authority, they're kind of lost. They can't read information online or in scientific studies as it applies to the patient right in front of them, which really should be shocking to many of the listeners here.
Yeah. So moving on to the next topic, it is, what is a technology in your life that you're using that is affordable, but that has really improved the quality of your life? And so I think this week, my answer is going to be an ultra slim USB drive. So I'm holding one in my hands right here. It looks quite small. It looks like the size of, significantly smaller than your thumb, and it uses the old USB-A adapter to it. And so I like this, and I was just looking and I saw online you can get them for $15 or so. We all are familiar with the USB thumb drive. This is called a ultra slim thumb drive, so it's smaller than your thumb. The part that sticks out is much smaller than your thumb. And I saw them a little more expensive, but up to 512 gigabytes in size. So that's probably going to surprise a lot of people on this call, 512 gigabytes. So I remember in the old days, your laptop hard drive was significantly smaller than 512 gigabytes. And then you might have had an external drive, and that was also significantly smaller than 512 gigabytes. And today, people like to put their information online, but you can always be locked out of online, or someone or online can be hacked, and so it's helpful to have key documents on a backup drive often. And so here's a backup drive. What's nice about this being so small and much smaller than thumb drives is that it lives in your laptop. So you could imagine being at work and then going on a business trip, and this simply lives in your laptop. And then before you go on your business trip, you save documents to it, and then you pull it out and you leave it on your work desk, and you take your laptop with you. But it lives in your laptop. It's not like a thumb drive where it's sticking out in a way that it will break off if you do anything with it or whatever. So I didn't know that this level, it's much smaller than thumb drives, much bigger capacity than old thumb drives, and it means that you don't need an external drive with cable anymore. It's just a tiny thumb drive that lives in your laptop. So anyway, that's my and it's very affordable these days. So that's my technology that I think improves your quality of life. Uh, Nicholas, do you want to bring a technology to us?
Sure. Talk about two. One I'm getting next weekend. I'm going to get a chip implant in my hand, right, for several things, right? So it will be RFID. So I can store things like, so I can do payments with it, for example. I can store certain information on it. I have an app that I can control it with. So I can open doors, keys, cars, things like that. Which is a bit gimmicky, but I also Neuralink solve many healthcare challenges. For example, much more accurately measure our blood markers. And the other thing that I recently used is in crypto, right? So I'm not sure if people who are not familiar with crypto probably don't know, but if you are a little bit, I can highly recommend go use a tool called Aave. So that's aave.com. And what you can do there basically is get a mortgage without a banker, and you can get it in 2 minutes. And it's really fascinating and shows you a bit how that new financial work is working, right? So what I do there is I put up my own crypto, so Bitcoin and Ethereum as collateral, just as you own any other kinds of assets, and then I can borrow stable coins against it, right? And the key of it is there's no intermediary, there's no bank. There's just like a liquidity pool. Others put up their collateral so others can borrow it. And it's at my own risk, right? So if my collateral falls below a certain threshold, then it gets automatically liquidated. So, I need to over collateralize. And it gives me the metrics like liquidation threshold and things like that. So it's totally on my own responsibility. And I used that loan to basically self-mortgage myself. And I bought my apartment from it. So, and that's really useful because I'm an international. I don't live in Germany nor in the United States. And it makes it hard for me to get mortgages for buying property in like Honduras, where most banks in the world say, no, I'm not going to give you any loans. So that, I think, shows you something that's possible with crypto and gives you a peek into the financial future.
That's great. So any others, or should we move on to our main topic?
If you want to talk about Apple Notes as an ultimate productivity tool, sure.
Yeah, that's a great one. So I think many people here have an Apple device of some sort, but when they think of productivity, they think of task list, or they think of Microsoft OneNote or Evernote, or and Apple Note they think of as too simple, maybe. But you use Apple Notes for productivity.
Exactly. So many of the listeners will know the midwit meme, right? So it's basically describes an IQ barbell, and on the one side is kind of dumb, and that person is using Apple Notes. It's simple. And then in the middle, you have Notion integrated with a database, and you can sort of have nested like links, and you can have sort of stacking notes on top of each other and things like that, and sort of you have your second brain or something like that. And on the smart end of the IQ distribution, just Apple Notes. Right, it's simple, it does the job. And I've become a great fan of Apple Notes. I think people really underrate the enormous value of being able to access it with one click offline. Right, so your notes are automatically synced. There's nothing to worry about, nothing to log in. It's just so beautiful, and you don't need all these backlinks, right? So you just once in a while have to organize your note a bit, and then you use the search function. And the search function or the search filter is brilliant. I find anything right away right now. So Apple Notes, ultimate productivity tool.
That's great. So next up, personal notices. So I'll just mention, for those of you in Boston, I have one of my Boston Health Innovation Nights coming up Tuesday, November 14th. That's in 2 weeks, with Jonathan Bush, the CEO of Zeus Health, former CEO of Athena Health. He's coming to talk about what are the barriers to interoperability in healthcare. And it turns out that it's the year 2024, and there's still lots of barriers to interoperability in U.S. healthcare, despite more than 15 years of priority to reduce those barriers. So I hope those of you in Boston can come join our reception and innovation night on Tuesday, November 14th with Jonathan Bush. Email me or check out stephenwardell.eventbrite.com for tickets. Nicholas, any personal notices?
Yeah, so I'm right now at a conference called Hereticon, which is in Miami, which is very unusual, right? Sort of by Founders Fund and Pirate Wires. So it's the universe of Peter Thiel, where people come with like very fringe and heretic ideas and are kind of in a safe space to express them, even though it's not necessarily politically correct or opportune. So that's a lot of fun. And there's a lot of biotech and health people here. And I'm also can highly recommend what is one of my favorite conferences in the United States, the Vision Weekend by the Foresight Institute, which is really where you come to jump to the frontier of biotech, of longevity, of things like cryonics and body replacement and things like that, or sort of brain emulation or things like that. So this is really a lot of fun. I'm really looking forward to that on September 6 to 8, the Vision Weekend by the Foresight Institute.
That's great. And I heard of Hereticon, and I'm trying to think of the most, and this year's theme of Hereticon. So first of all, if people are at Hereticon in Miami, they should reach out to you and say hi. And I'm impressed you took off time from the conference to be on this show. So thank you for doing that. And I think the theme this year is the apocalypse.
The apocalypse,
and
exactly.
the conference. I saw. So apparently it's invitation only, and I did not get an invitation, so I'm upset about that. But apparently, one of the selling points that they're bragging about is that there are at least 2 children alive this year who were conceived at the last Hereticon. So I don't know if that was a selling point for it. So anyway, but that's great. So now we'll move on to our main topic, which is building a health innovation city, creating a center of innovation that can get you to market faster than the traditional U.S. path. So you've described that Vitalia, we've talked about Vitalia, and it is on the island of Roatan in Honduras, and you've said your background is public policy, and that you needed a change in public policy to create. The simplest way of thinking of it is get your drug approved in 6 months, not 10 years, and other health innovations as well. And we've actually have heard of Americans who've gone to Roatan for gene therapy or for other kinds of treatments that were available earlier in Honduras than they were in America. And to create this city and this community, you had to change jurisdictions, and you had to make special things about your jurisdiction, and you had to leave the U.S., which is subject to FDA jurisdiction, go to a different place. And so, tell us about that. What is different and special? You've changed. This is like an enterprise zone, maybe, but you have a different framework here.
Yeah, that's comparable. So the Cayman Islands, for example, have the Cayman Enterprise Zone. There are several special economic zones in Panama and Costa Rica and Uruguay. In Uruguay, they generate a very large percentage of GDP. What many people don't know is Dubai consists of 40 different special economic zones that compete with each other. One of them is actually focused on healthcare. It's called the Healthcare Innovation City, right? So that name was taken. And these special economic zones compete with each other for businesses, right? So each of them have a different set of laws, right? So they're under certain national laws and also religious laws in the United Emirates, but then they basically have state autonomy to some degree, as the United States is conceived, right? So it's increasingly state level autonomy has been strongly superseded by federal and administrative law, but it's still the original US idea, right? That smaller jurisdictions or individual states can compete. And the idea of special economic zones is really a reform idea, right? Because there's many countries that are very monolithic that can't reform that easily in an entire country because there's too many entrenched interest groups. But what's much easier is to start with sort of a small, often unused or unpopulated territory. So China, for example, saw the success of Hong Kong and of Singapore. So Hong Kong being kind of one of the OG administrative regions that proved the success of special economic zones and of British common law particularly. They were saying, okay, let's try this capitalism thing in Shenzhen. And one of the
Really interesting. So I think our audience is really curious. If you could have a more open regulatory environment, what would you see pop up there? What are some of the cutting edge medical innovations you would see pop up there? And I've actually heard of Americans flying to Roatan to get treatment. But so I think you mentioned that there's current trial or use or research on things like plasmid gene therapy. Can you talk about some of the examples of what's going on there that they chose to live there? That's very interesting. So the story here is that you had a concept for a therapy, and then you conducted trials, and you did it in what were they in Honduras, and then that gave you the right to use the therapy for a physician to prescribe and use the therapy in Honduras, and then presumably they're going to want to do further research and get this approved in other countries. But at least for now, you have a shorter path to use it in Honduras. Is that right? So we mentioned a little bit about, and I'm looking at we have in our show plan. I'm looking at the concepts section. So we mentioned a little bit about expedited clinical trials. You could get from 10 years down to 6 months. I think if we knew that it would be at equivalent, then there's no reason not to make it 6 months, not 10 years. And so that's intriguing. What are some other concepts of speeding up innovation that could be done more readily in a jurisdiction like Roatan? What are some of the other concepts that help to speed up innovation? And by the way, for our audience, if you have any further questions, any I think any questions for Niklas, any further questions for either of us, feel free to ask them now. Also, right to try. What is the state of right to try in the U.S. if you happen to know? I don't think there's a widespread right to try in the U.S. And are there jurisdictions like Roatan or others where there is a right to try? What does that look like? What does that mean? That's really interesting. There's a famous story about the modern limited liability shareholder corporation, which is that if you cycle back 300 years ago, there was a concept of absolute responsibility of companies, which was you couldn't form a company and then say that these people who own the company and are employed by the company have a limit to their liability. If you were four Dutchmen creating a trading company and you put $100,000 into it and you lost $1 million, you were absolutely responsible for the $1 million. You could not. And in the US colonial and post-revolutionary period of the 1700s, there was this incredible competition among states. We're talking about Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, New York, New Jersey. And a state would say, and they were taking step by step, they were coming closer and closer to the modern day limited liability shareholder company. And they faced opposition. People said, you can't, that's going to create a company where an owner can only lose the value of their shares. But that's not responsible. Because what if the company loses more than that? You have to be able to go after the owner. And so step by step, and every time a state made an innovation toward the current model, hundreds of businesses would move to the state to take advantage of that model. And today, nothing's perfect, but most people like the current model where you can buy into a few shares of Novartis and then sell out. And if Novartis has a catastrophe with one of its drugs, no one's going to come after you and say that you owned shares on January 1st, and therefore we can come after you for all of your net worth or whatever. So And so that's interesting, where we could see in U.S. states, and here Montana, which is a state that I think, sadly, most people would say Montana has a lot of trouble competing as a location against Minnesota or Illinois or Washington State. But they can do this. This is how they can become, that they can innovate and they can become a right to try state. So very interesting. So we're going to sign off in a moment. But before we sign off, can you you've given us some critiques of the FDA. Now, I think most Americans in general, they like the FDA because the FDA says something works. And then if there's a problem, they also know they can go to the FDA, and their congressmen can go to the FDA, they can go to the FDA, and there will be great experts who will try to address that problem. So most Americans like the FDA. There's also a story from the 60s of thalidomide and how some countries had terrible problems with pregnant women and malformed fetuses with thalidomide, and America was spared that. But the FDA also, if the FDA does not approve a drug that works and it's approved in other countries, then you literally have people suffering and dying because of a delay of a year or 5 years, and people with worse drugs or no drugs they can take that, and having to leave the country, go somewhere else to get treated. So there's a flip side to this. What is the critique of the FDA that you've mentioned in the past?
Sure. I like to recommend the website, by the way, FDA-review.org, where you can read that in more detail. But the short version is nobody's against the idea.
That's great. Thank you. And I think there was an intriguing story during the pandemic, which was that in the early months of the pandemic, it was seen as the world's largest global emergency. China was shutting down cities of 10 million. People were collapsing in the street. Some people, often elder people, were having deadly respiratory collapse, or people being put on ventilators. And doctors said, it's going to take years and years to develop a vaccine for this. And then there was a major project to develop a vaccine and approve it, and it was much faster than anyone could have predicted. The amount of time it took to conceptualize a vaccine, come up with a plan, a detailed plan for a vaccine, to get it approved and manufactured was much, much faster than people expected or than had ever been done before on a large scale, I think. And so then that. No, tell us about that.
It was 2 days.
Wow.
You also know when that was.
When was that?
It was in January 2020.
Yeah, and so that's an important point, because there has always been a risk of injury with vaccines. And in fact, I think the US Congress created a special fund in the 1970s because they knew with every vaccine, 1 in a million people is going to get hurt. And so the fund was to just give a money compensation to anybody. They would have national campaigns to vaccinate people. And here's a fund for the 1 in a million people who get hurt, to help them. And so, but it's sort of a social medical decision whether it's worth it when you have a giant problem, you have a potentially extremely valuable solution, but some people are going to get hurt. And so, do we agree that we're going to do that? That could take much longer to decide than it would be to design the vaccine. But it also flips the system on its head, which is to say that if you could develop a vaccine, there's many diseases that could have vaccines developed for them. For example, in the northeast of the US, there's Lyme disease. It's in many places, but it's very serious in the northeast of the US. And so if you can design a vaccine in a weekend and have it come to market faster than any other vaccine, then why do we still not have a vaccine for Lyme disease. Why don't we start a project and develop a vaccine for Lyme disease and bring it to market in 1 year from today? It's been a crisis for 20 years or longer. So why don't we have that yet? So part of the answer may be that we start to get these things coming out of Vitalia City and Roatan and economic development zones that have jurisdictional innovation for them. And one of the marvels of healthcare and software is that it can be developed anywhere, but after it's developed, it can be applied everywhere. Well, good. Well, any other anything else you want to pass on to our audience? Thank you. Yes, and so you can check out Vitalia.city is the URL, and the pop-up city is going on for 2 months, starting January 6th. And so you can schedule your vacation to coincide with their pop-up city. Well, thank you. And thank you so much, Niklas, for coming on the show. And you've been listening to the Digital Health Investor Talk show with Stephen Wardell. We're publishing this show as an episode in our podcast series, the Digital Health Investor Talk show. You can subscribe on Apple and Spotify, and don't forget to rate us. We love a 5-star review. And our next show is coming up on Wednesday, November 6th. It's called The Consolidation Wave is Coming with Ari Tulla. And for our Boston audience, we have an innovation night on Tuesday, November 12th at 5:30 at the Liberty Hotel in downtown Boston with our guest, Jonathan Bush, the CEO of Zeus Health. Thank you, and look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye-bye.